Welcome everyone to the Center for Governance and Markets, our virtual conversation series. I'm Jennifer Brick-Murtazashvili. I'm the director of the center and a professor of public and international affairs here at the University of Pittsburgh. Briefly, the Center for Governance and Markets is a pretty new research center here on campus devoted to understanding institutional diversity and performance around the world and to understanding the ways those institutions contribute to peace, prosperity, and human well-being. We do this through cutting-edge research, engaging the policy world, and through deep community engagement. We are delighted to have three very distinguished guests with us today to talk about government reform in the United States. This panel is something that I've wanted to do for many, many years. The issue of governance reform is one that is in the minds of so many of us following the COVID pandemic, but one that is not getting quite enough attention in the media, and I think it's very close to many of us in our hearts, but we don't see it being discussed by our public leaders. And about a month or so ago, Professor Kettl and Philip Howard co-authored an op-ed in Newsweek. It was about the issue that Democrats aren't talking about, and it was in preparation for the Democratic National Convention, and in hopes that op-ed would get some attention and get folks talking about this issue. I read it with great interest and was really excited to be able to bring them here today, so to talk about these issues more in general. And we know that it's not just an issue that the Democrats aren't talking about, it's an issue that many of our politicians aren't talking about. So it's exciting to have this conversation today. So just briefly to introduce our panelists, we have Donald Kettl, who's a Sid Richardson professor at the LBJ School at the University of Texas, Austin. He specializes in public management and public policy. Many of us know him when he served as the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Volcker Alliance, Brookings Institution, and the Partnership for Public Service. He's written many books, but most recently, he's authored The Divided States of America, Why Federalism Doesn't Work, and Can Governments Earn Our Trust, which came out a couple of years ago. He's served for the US government and consulted on many levels, really working on issues of governance reform, so he knows these issues from the inside out. Next, let us welcome Philip K. Howard, who is a well-known leader of government and legal reform in the United States. His latest book, Try Common Sense, Replacing the Failed Ideologies of the Right and the Left, came out in 2019. He's the author of many books, and one of my favorites is The Rule of Nobody, which came out in 2014. I've assigned it to many of my classes, alongside Kettl's classic textbook in public administration. He was a member of President Trump's CEO Council advising on infrastructure, and he regularly testifies before Congress. He is the director and founder of an organization called Common Good, which is a nonpartisan national coalition dedicated to restoring common sense to America. His 2015 report, 2 Years, Not 10 Years, delineated the economic and environmental costs of delayed infrastructure approvals and has seen endorsements from leaders of both political parties. And finally, let me welcome my colleague, Gary Hallibaugh, who is an associate professor of public administration here at the University of Pittsburgh. And his research focuses primarily on American political institutions. He investigates how executives and legislators respond to electoral and institutional constraints when choosing individuals to serve in appointed positions, the decisions of appointees and appointed bureaucrats once in office, and the importance of personality traits in this process. His work has appeared in the top journals in public administration and political science, and you can look at them on his website. He's the co-author of the recent book, Personality, Polarization, and the Transformation of the US Congress. So without further ado, I want to throw things out to our guests to talk about this important issue and ways forward. And Philip, let's begin with you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jen, and thanks for having me. Nice to meet you, Gary.
You as well.
It's a real honor to be on a panel with Don Kettl. It's one of my public policy heroes. I've been given 10 minutes to say what I have to say, so just cut me off. I think we're at a 1917 moment where we know that things are going to change. We just feel the tectonic plates moving, but no one seems quite sure how they're going to change. And my concern is that none of the competing visions that we read about and hear about on the left and the right will address what I think is the main cause of voter alienation, which is government's inability to get things done. Let me start with a story. A couple of years ago, a tree fell in a creek in Franklin Township, New Jersey, caused flooding. The mayor sent in a backhoe to pull the tree out of the creek. And then the town lawyer helpfully said, well, it's a class C1 creek, whatever that means. And you have to get an official permit before you pull a natural object out of a class C1 creek. So it took the town 10 days and $12,000 in legal fees to get a permit to do what was completely obvious, which is to pull a tree out of a creek that was causing flooding. Now, this year, we've had all kinds of incidents like that that have had sort of national repercussions. When COVID showed up in January in Seattle, there was actually a public health study going on of strains of flu, and the swabs had already been collected, and the researchers wanted to test the swabs to see if there's COVID. Fantastic. It took them 4 weeks to get approval to do that, at which point, of course, the COVID had spread dramatically. You know, thousands of people took to the streets over the gruesome killing of George Floyd. Turns out that the cop really shouldn't have been a cop. He had a problem record. His colleagues said he was tightly wound. It's not a good trait for somebody who's on the streets with a loaded gun. It also turned out that it's basically impossible to get rid of a bad cop, unless it's on the front page of the news, because of the way the bureaucratic structures and the collective bargaining agreements have grown up in this country. There's people who criticize government tend to blame political polarization, and indeed that is a big problem because it prevents change, but it's not really the main source of daily frustration. Remember back in 2009, during the financial crisis, Congress allocated $800 billion to stimulate the economy, and a lot of that money was supposed to be spent on infrastructure. Everyone agreed that a lot of it should be spent on infrastructure, and the money was allocated. 5 years later, the Obama White House have a report that basically buried the footnote is that only a tiny percentage got spent on infrastructure. Why was that? Because no official had the authority to expedite the permits and the process that's necessary to get projects moving again. Not even the President of the United States, duly elected by a majority of citizens. So there are all these big problems in society that people argue about, which are big problems. You know, inadequate healthcare coverage, climate change, income stagnation, and more. But the alienation of most voters, I think, is closer to home. And it's the idiocies they see in their daily interactions in schools and other aspects of government. And the problem, is, as Jen said at the beginning, is that neither party has any plank in their platform to deal with this. The Republican, Trump talks about draining the swamp and deregulation and such, but the answer to these problems isn't to get rid of government. Most Americans want Medicare, they want clean air, they want them to work properly. The Democrats have this fantastic platform to make government bigger, more healthcare. Biden said he's going to spend money on infrastructure, but he's not saying anything about how he's going to get the infrastructure projects actually moving. So I think that there's one of these moments where we need to sort of understand that the emperor that we've created to deliver public service has no clothes, that there's this flaw that really goes to the heart of not what government does, but how it does it. It's a flaw in the operating system of government that we rebuilt after the 1960s on the explicit premise of replacing human judgment with dictates on exactly how to do things properly. So we've got 150 million words of detailed federal law, far beyond the capacity of any human to understand it, and several billion words of state and local law. And the net effect of that is that officials and citizens are both disempowered from taking responsibility to fix the problems in front of them. And then other officials are disempowered from holding anyone accountable. So we've got this system of central planning in effect, except that the central planners are dead. Somebody in 1976 wrote a rule about Class C1 creeks, and that prevents the people in Franklin Township from rolling up their sleeves and just doing what makes sense. So I'm going to close with a story. New York Times had a feature article a while back about regulation of an apple orchard, family-owned apple orchard. It turned out that this family-owned apple orchard in upstate New York is subject to about 5,000 rules from 17 different regulatory programs. They kept 13 clipboards in their office to try to keep it all straight. The degree of granularity of these rules was astonishing. There was one rule, for example, that said you had to put a cloth over an apple cart after the apples were fixed for the trip to the barn. It takes a few minutes to protect the apples against bird droppings. Now, those apples have been growing on the trees for 5 months, and the government hasn't done anything to protect them against bird droppings. You know, it's the kind of, it's stuff like that that drives Americans to distraction, drives them to vote for Donald Trump. And no one is talking about it. And this movement we need is not a movement to, in my view, to put one group on top of another group or other. There are lots of changes that we need to make in our society, but the main movement we need is a movement just to fix things, to give people the freedom to fix things. And, you know, I think that the party that comes up with a coherent vision for doing that will go a long way towards seizing public opinion. The Republican Party doesn't exist as far as I can tell, and the Democratic Party is in somewhat disarray as well. So my pitch here is, let's go back to letting people be American again. Let's go back to letting people roll up their sleeves, take responsibility, get things done. Let's be able to hold people accountable, both in public service and outwards. And, you know, America can calm down.
Great, thank you. Professor Kettl.
Thanks much, and thanks for the chance to be with you here today. Thanks to you, Jennifer, for organizing this, and Gary, it's terrific to have a chance to be able to work with you, but especially to appear with my good friend Philip Howard, who's my hero for bringing the idea of common sense to government. It's just the very idea is so anathema to the way in which things so often operate. Just having somebody say that out loud is itself such an incredible accomplishment. I can't resist beginning with a story. Back once upon a time, in addition to having served as dean at the University of Maryland, I was director of the La Follette School at the University of Wisconsin. And when I was there, I had an inside story with my team, which was that any sentence that began with, wouldn't it make sense that, was immediately ruled out of order, because I knew that there's no chance we were going to be able to get anything like that to happen. It's not just in government, but it unfortunately happens in universities as well. And the idea of having common sense actually govern what we do is something that is just too often anathema to the way in which we operate. But I think increasingly this matters, and it matters a lot. One important factoid, because we know that the trust in government right now is abysmal, but McKinsey has done some work, and they've discovered that 2/3 of the trust in government is the product of citizens' interaction with government officials and the quality of services that we get. There's actually evidence to support what it is that Philip just was arguing, that having government work well on behalf of citizens is in fact what citizens want, that they know it, they see it, they recognize it, and when they see it, in fact, trust in government improves. And so that's a critically important issue for our times, but the challenge is trying to figure out how we try to go about doing it. And as Philip's pointed out, the problem is that we have what is clearly one of the most important elections, pick your time period, the decade, a generation, the century. There's something fundamental going on here, but the problem is that whoever it is who wins, if it turns out that they fail an execution in January, February, March, and April of next year, they'll be doomed before they even start. And the reason is, again, people are looking for government to work better. The problem with Trump is the question of whether or not messaging can overcome management, of whether or not in the end he can talk about the issues long enough to convince people that the results are disconnected from whatever it is that he's doing. For the Democrats, that the problem is, will he be done before he even starts if he can't find a way to deliver on what it is that people now expect? Because the inescapable reality, for starters, is that whoever it is who's sworn in January of next year will have not so much just the problem of dealing with the economy, but also COVID. And the problem of COVID at that point is going to be trying to figure out how quickly and fairly and effectively to get out a vaccine that works to Americans, which is a monumental administrative challenge of the sort that we haven't even really begun to talk about. To try to emphasize these points, let me try to suggest maybe 5 things that we ought to be thinking about that we're not. Because it's very clear that neither candidate is engaging in these issues, and that I think both of them will suffer in ways that are sometimes imperceptible in terms of the root causes, but nevertheless will suffer if they don't get their arms around it. So 5 things, 5 issues to try to deal with this. The first is that some of this seems so obvious when you start talking about it, but people don't. And it's because people tend to pay attention to management only in crisis. That was unfortunately the big lesson of Hurricane Katrina, where President Bush came, put his arm around Michael Brown, said, "You're doing a heck of a job, Brownie," when the one thing that was clear to everybody who was watching is that the one thing that wasn't happening was that Brownie was doing a heck of a job. The challenge of trying to find ways of developing a strategy for responding to that enormous, searing natural disaster was something that became clear only after it happened. And it became so difficult to get people to pay attention to the process of managing results at the time. Why did it matter? Well, it mattered in part because that was the point for all the ups and downs of public opinion in the Bush presidency. That was the point where his negatives exceeded his positives and he never recovered. So politically, there is that issue that is inescapable. It's inescapable politically. But on top of that, what we have now is Katrina 1,000 times over, affecting every community in the country. And so the issue of trying to figure out how to manage this response is something that nobody's going to be able to escape, but which frankly nobody really wants to talk about. The second issue is that when we do tend to talk about it, we tend to talk about these issues about delivering results in terms of structure and process, about creating more red tape, passing more laws, about reorganizing government agencies. And we don't tend to focus on the third thing, which is the need to focus on outcomes. Because, tell you the truth, most Americans really don't give a damn about which agency is in charge of what. They have a problem, they want the problem solved. If you have ever had the experience of having to call 911 for the rescue squad to arrive, that siren just doesn't get to your front door fast enough no matter what you do. It turns out that if you have a problem with a hurricane and you're stuck on a rooftop, the big lesson of Hurricane Katrina was, don't really care much, don't really care who gets you off that rooftop. You just want to get yourself evacuated and to be able to escape. One of the lessons of state legislators is that they get lots of calls about what can you do to help fix my Social Security or my Medicare? And one of the things that state legislators realize is not the answer is to say, I'm really sorry, but that we don't do that. That's the federal government's job. Every state legislator who wants to stay in office learns that casework means solving problems that may not even be necessarily in their own jurisdiction. People don't care about structure and process. They care about outcomes, and we don't focus on outcomes enough. But to get at the outcomes, and this is my 4th point, that we have to, in some ways, re-engineer our systems and make them work better. We know that we've got systems that are increasingly complicated, but for that matter, my car is really complicated. I remember ages ago thinking about buying a car and looking under the hood and having at least a rough idea of what was going on underneath there. If you've looked under the hood of any car these days, you have to be both a computer engineer and a sophisticated electrical and engineer to be able to have any sense of what's going on, because there's just this block of stuff underneath there. But I don't understand what's going on there, but it works reliably. It's complicated, but we figured out how to do it. The problem is that too many of our government issues are not only complicated, but also complex. They are multi-rooted, They require a multifaceted solution. In the case of COVID-19, we need to make sure that we have the federal and the state and the local governments working together, that we need to have the government working together with the nonprofit sector. We need to have that network working together with the private sector as well. Do you need any evidence of that? Just look at the chain that produces the testing results. The federal government deciding whether or not we need to get tested at all, what tests are valid, the state governments creating data systems to track the way in which it's happening. We see that local governments are trying to get the tests out to their citizens, but who's administering the test? Well, you may go down to your friendly CVS or your Walgreens. That is the private sector to be able to get that done. Even if it's a local public health department that's doing the testing in a parking lot, the tests are being sent to private labs that are in charge of processing it, sometimes in ways that are not consistent. I mean, we've got a problem and a set of issues in the universe that increasingly are complex, involving multifaceted sets of problems that require network solutions that we're just not very good at thinking about. But again, going back to the question of outcomes, citizens don't care. If they need a test, they want to get a test. If they get a test, they want quick results. We're about to see that play itself out again when we start looking at how we're going to vaccinate a population. The leading 3 candidates for the vaccines out there will be requiring not 1, but 2 shots. And they're produced by private sector companies, some of which are multinational and global. And so we not only have federal, state, local, public, private, nonprofit, but global institutions involved in this as well. But in the end, all citizens are going to care about is, can I get a vaccine? Will I be protected? Can I go out again? Can I have a meal at a restaurant without having to worry about getting sick? And so it's understanding how to get leverage over these complex systems, which is the core of things, which we're not very good at thinking about because we tend to focus in terms of inputs instead of outcomes, because we tend to focus on processes in terms of structures. In a lot of cases, we don't tend to think about this at all until we end up having these crises. And that's the challenge that we face. The ways of getting at this, and this is really my 5th point, of getting a government that is increasingly agile, that has the ability to understand not only what needs to get done, but how to get it done, and to know that it can't do it all itself, and devising systems of governance that reach across these challenges. This is all really doable, but it's not going to be doable unless both candidates understand that this is the job that they're elected to do, unless they get the capacity for getting it done, unless they understand that the electoral consequences, the political consequences of failing to do this will be something that will come back to bite them sooner or later. If you have any doubt about that, all you have to do is look and see what happened to George W. Bush and what happened after Hurricane Katrina. At the beginning of the Obama administration, I had a quiet meeting off to the side with one of the senior people in the incoming administration who said, what is it that I ought to think about? What should I know? What is it that we need to consider? And what I said was, sooner or later, hard to tell what it is, but you will have your own Hurricane Katrina. And when you have your own Hurricane Katrina, if you begin then to try to figure out what to do, you already will have lost the game. It's a matter of trying to put these issues front and center. Not that they're things that everybody in America needs to debate and figure out in the same way we're going to talk about the future of healthcare or the future of the environment or the future of public health, but it's something that the candidates need to make sure it gets done, because if it doesn't, they and we will suffer for it. And one of the big challenges of the campaign so far is that this is something we haven't been talking about at all.
Great, Gary.
Okay, sorry about that. So, before I speak, I want to thank the CGM for having me, to Jen for organizing this, to Don and Philip for their important takes on government reform, and perhaps most importantly, a big, big, big thank you to Sophia for putting this together and making sure all the trains ran on time, so to speak. So thank you all. So anyway, I want to offer some thoughts on what Don and Philip just talked about. I think we broadly agree in a lot of different respects, but there's also probably some not insignificant points of departure, at least from where I'm coming from, how different political trends might pose obstacles to what they propose. And I actually I'm actually pretty happy about the fact that Abby asked the question that was asked, because I think I'm going to, what I'm going to say is going to address that in several different respects. So before I begin, I want to say it up front that I'm fully in agreement that, some sort of, as they say in a Newsweek piece, as they mentioned in their spoken remarks, some sort of very major reform of government is likely needed and arguably desired by most. But I think there is a lot of actual disagreement over what implementing these ideas might look like. So for example, stepping away from COVID for a little bit, we should think, for example, about the idea or the issue of drug testing as a prerequisite for food stamp benefits. In the few cases where these sorts of programs have been allowed to proceed without being stopped by some sort of judge, the evidence generally suggests that they're pretty ineffective at catching positive cases, even if test refusals are counted as positive cases. In many cases, they often cost more money than they save. And that's, of course, assuming benefits participation remains constant, a point to which I'll return in 2 seconds. And they also often promote stereotypes about benefits recipients. But they also remain pretty popular with the public at large and might be effective at reducing participation in the benefits programs, thus reducing government outlays overall as a second-order result. Or we can think of unemployment, which is probably a little bit more salient in the current environment. We've probably heard a little bit about Florida's, at this point, pretty well maligned unemployment system. As has been reported in the press, it was designed by then Governor, now Senator Rick Scott, and it's been reported pretty widely that it was designed to, quote, make it harder for people to get benefits and keep unemployment numbers low enough to give the governor something to brag about. And these are actual quotes from people who were participating in the design process. More recently, and this happened within the last week, current Governor DeSantis cut a program that provided an additional $300 in weekly unemployment benefits. So, these two examples, and there are numerous others, I think suggest that there is this tension between those who think they're making it easier to collect unemployment benefits, and I'm strawmanning a bit here, I admit, is a winning issue, based largely in beliefs about the appeal of good governance, and others who believe that the fiscal appeal of saving money on unpaid benefits, often through increasing administrative burdens, will win the day at the ballot box. So that can really be recast, as many of our current political debates are, as people having different views on the proper role of government and what an effective, streamlined government would look like and what it would do. In fact, taking a step back, and this is part of the subtext of both Don's comments and Philip's comments, we should be and hopefully are pretty fully aware that lots of government programs are ineffective by design. Administrative burden is often, but not always, means that benefits programs pay out less, and it gives legislators at all levels of government some tailor-made opportunities to provide casework, which Don mentioned is extremely important to aggrieved constituents. And of course, there's also entrenched interests that seek to block reform for their own reasons. For example, every couple of years, we see news stories about how tax preparation software companies have successfully lobbied Congress to prevent the implementation of automatic income tax filing, thus making it harder for us to file our own taxes and thus preserving their market share. So the common theme of all of that is that I'm not necessarily certain that proactively proposing a government reform agenda is a winning issue per se, nor is it one that might be actually implemented if serious proponents were to be elected, whatever a serious proponent is, whoever the serious proponent is. But this is a huge caveat, and this goes back to Abby's question. This is a huge caveat at the federal level. And a huge part of this is because of the specific duties that the federal government does relative to the state and local levels. Streamlining federal procurement guidelines and providing more oversight over the contracting process might be of interest to the people in this room, but most voters probably couldn't care less. Of course, at the federal level, exceptions will occur. Don mentioned crises situations, which kind of throw everything out of whack. But for the most part, absent black swan crisis events, these are probably largely relegated to agencies or programs that provide direct benefits. So I think most of people here, hopefully, remember the awful Veterans Health Administration scandal of 2014. But to recapitulate, VHA staff falsified appointment records to appear to meet waiting time targets, and many veterans died while waiting for service. There was a huge bipartisan blowback against this, but that's probably, I would say almost definitely, due to the particular type of benefits and the constituency affected. So this is but one example, but I think this leads us to some potentially uncomfortable but useful conclusions and some possible paths forward if we want to think about the importance of governmental reform, good government, whatever you want to call it, as a campaign issue. First of all, means-tested programs like Medicaid, like unemployment, to a lesser extent, like most benefits for the most part, are almost always going to be under greater political attack than universalist programs like Social Security, Medicare, and heck, even the VA. Having means testing in place, though it reduces cost, potentially, though it might make programs easier to pass because of the, again, lower cost, creates an implied us versus them mentality with many people ineligible for benefits, casting aspersions on those who are, and the notion of deserving versus undeserving poor also means there will be additional skepticism of those who are eligible. However, again, the obvious appeal of these programs is that they're easier to pass because they're less expensive, and we can prevent those who don't quote unquote deserve them from accessing them. More universalist programs, on the other hand, will develop a much greater constituency over time if they can be passed in the first place, and that's a huge caveat, and they'll be easier to defend on average because everyone benefits. So a Medicare for All program would likely be highly supported 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now after final implementation, and people would likely support efforts to make it easier to access those benefits, but the odds of actually getting there because of the initial resistance to creating the universalist programs tends to be pretty slim. But it also probably helps to explain why people are resistant to changing these programs without clear benefits and rationale. Most of us are probably either recall or are aware of the debate over privatizing Social Security in the early to mid 2000s, even though there's a good amount of admittedly contested evidence that major changes to Social Security are needed to ensure its long-term viability. It has also long been a third rail of American politics, with many people supporting keeping it more or less as is, despite a lingering doubt that it'll be able to pay out its promised benefits in the long term, because everyone benefits and everyone knows that conditional on them living long enough or having some sort of disability that qualifies them, Social Security will be there for them in the future. And in fact, there actually is some evidence that the privatization debate was a major factor in the Democratic Party's sweep in the 2006 elections. Second, and this is probably a little bit more on point, people are probably going to be more receptive to good governance or other government reform messages when they provide more tangible or direct benefits. Again, as I've already mentioned, streamlining procurement guidelines and providing more oversight over the contracting process, for example, will interest everyone in this room. Again, I'm caricaturing a little bit, but most voters aren't going to actually care. But voters do care about being able to collect promised Medicare benefits, promised Social Security benefits, having responsive fire departments where those are funded by public coffers, or having reasonable, good schools, which is likely to be an issue in the next wave of state and especially local elections. Reliable public transportation, at least in areas where people rely on it. We can think of some recent heated debates over the state and future of the New York City subway, or as people who have read Don's book might recall, efficient removal of snow, the lack of which has ended the career of many Midwestern and Northeastern mayors. So poor design and our implementation of these programs like these are probably aggrieve and motivate voters. Because of the type of programs they are and the type of benefits that they provide. So looking at the levels of government responsible for administering these programs is probably a good first step. And this speaks to Abby's question. So if we're looking at the local level, we might run into another trend that might further increase the viability of a reform platform. And that's the fact that many local elections are either nonpartisan, either officially so or effectively so due to local one-party dominance, and the salience of political parties tends to be a bit lower at that level. So while there might be some debate over the best or most efficient way to fund snow removal, for example, smart mayors in the Midwest and Northeast know that it has to be done some way, somehow, if they want any hope of continuing some sort of political career. So where does that leave us? Well, I think there's an appetite for the sort of campaigner candidacy that Don and Phillips suggest. I think specific political concerns restrict its feasibility to lower levels of government. That's not to say it's not worthwhile. Indeed, these levels of government are responsible for most of the visible government services people use each day. but it also means we should be more specific and targeted when we discuss such proposals. It's not likely to be something that will help most national level candidates most of the time, though there are certainly exceptions like crisis situations such as Katrina or where we are right now. But it's something that we might expect state and especially local government candidates to try and perhaps succeed with. As a final example, or rather a final hypothetical, think about the sort of campaign you might run if you're an incumbent school board member running for re-election this year or next year. And if you're looking to unseat an incumbent school board member this year or next year, think about the sort of campaign you might run as well. I think this sort of thought experiment certainly suggests there is an audience for the message that Don and Philip have provided. I just think it has to be a little bit more targeted. And that's all I have for now. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Great, thank you. And I normally don't respond to these things, but I just thought I'd say a few words. I worked for the federal government for about 3 years before going to grad school. And I had the job of a lifetime, something I loved doing at the Agency for International Development. And after 3 years, I realized that working in the federal government wasn't for me because my job required me to master the federal acquisitions regulations. And so as a young person, really passionate and excited about foreign policy, and I was working in a US embassy on the border with Afghanistan on 9/11 and seeing so many exciting things and interesting things and scary things happening, I felt so hampered by what I could do because my life was procurement and contracting. So when I talk to young people today about their careers, and I teach many of them at our graduate program, I often discourage them from service in the federal government. For the reason I say, take that on later in your career, get your hands dirty. You have so much passion, so much excitement, work in a field where you can really make a difference. And I hate to say that, right? I don't want to discourage someone who wants to work in policy at a very high level, but I understand that the way that people can actually make a difference in policy, at least in the areas where I work, isn't necessarily at sort of those lower rung levels in the federal government, sort of starting out. Yes, they'll understand how the bureaucracy works. Yes, they'll have to manage it, but they won't necessarily be solving problems. And that's one of the big challenges that I see is how can we really motivate the young, creative people who might go into business, who might be entrepreneurs, to get them excited about serving in the government. And I just worry that the opportunities for people to be creative and to unleash their potential isn't necessarily there. But on the other hand, we brush up against these real constitutional constraints that we always teach about in public administration, right? Do you want to give the bureaucrats too much discretion? These are really big debates that we have. How much discretion do you give individuals who work in the government? Is it unconstitutional? So that's why I think Philip's comments are so important about thinking about accountability and responsibility rather than the federal acquisitions regulations. And just one more final word about trust. We have a huge trust deficit in our country. It's enormous. Politics has become a team sport. Everyone feels like they have to wear their politics on their sleeves. I find this within the university, I find this within religious institutions, I find it in my neighborhood. And this increasing polarization where everyone feels that they have to show what team they're a part of, I think is really damaging to us. And because when one administration comes to power, as we know, the next administration tries to discredit what the previous administration has done. Of course, that's part of politics. We're never going to be able to get rid of it. But I really worry about how this has undermined individual trust in all of our institutions and government included. And so it's wonderful to think about these reform efforts and many of these brilliant ideas, but without restoring that basic trust that individuals have, especially at the local level, is going to be really hard, I think, to recast any of the reforms that we're talking about. So we think about how can government regain trust. I want to take some lessons that I've spent the past 20 years working on Central Asia and Afghanistan. Spent a lot of time wondering why the state building efforts in Afghanistan didn't work. One of the reasons I've diagnosed is that a lot of outsiders, donors believe you give people things and that's how you win hearts and minds. It's through the provision of public goods and services. And what I found is that's not the case. People don't trust even what they perceive to be hollow gifts from the state. What they want more than anything else was to be treated with dignity and respect. And I think that many of the observations that have been made today deal with the fact that there's this alienation that individuals feel because at the local level, they're not being treated with this respect that they deserve. If we look at what's happening in police departments around the country, right? If we're seeing the protest movements that have taken shape, this has to do with deep alienation that individuals feel towards their governments at the local level, that they're not being treated with respect and maybe restraint. So on the one hand, yes, we need to talk about how to make public programs and the welfare state work more effectively and efficiently. But I think we also need to think about how a state can restrain itself to treat people with dignity. And I know that these two things are not necessarily completely at odds, but it's something that I'd like for us to think about as we consider this conversation. So I'm going to stop here. I don't know if anybody wants to respond before I open things up to questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to respond. Lots to talk about, but just in your last point, this is the point that legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron has talked about, the trust and respect idea. And law professor William Simon has written a lot about the interaction of citizens with public officials. And he told the story of a recent immigrant who had 4 children, and she filed the welfare forms. She needed welfare for them to survive in their early days of being in this country. She had filled out the forms too late for one of the children. So she shows up at the welfare office, and there happened to be a researcher there. And the researcher said, "I'm sorry, you're too late. You can't get," back and forth like that. The mother is almost in tears. And finally, the person at the window said, "There is nothing I can do." That was and so the mother left, distraught that she didn't have the money to, feed her child or whatever. So the researcher looked into it. It turned out there was nothing that clerk could do, but the person in the office next door had the authority to waive the late filing. And all the clerk had to do was say that. But in the mindset of how we've organized government, it's all about compliance and following the rules. And there's this whole body of psychological literature that working memory, the conscious part of our brain, is really quite limited. It's like an 8-bit processor. People can only retain 5 or 6 things. And so you end up having people in government have it beat into them that they're supposed to comply with these 1,000-page rule books, which is impossible. And they end up, they go brain dead. That clerk was brain dead. It's actually a physical phenomenon, and they can't access their long-term memory, the emotion, the trust and respect and the dignity that comes out of, your emotional intelligence and stuff. And so it shuts the door to that. So we've created a system that by design, although we didn't understand what all its effects were, basically means that people act like kind of bad robots rather often. And again, it drives people nuts. It's really, and this is not a problem that can be solved on a local level. It can be implemented on a local level. So I agree with Gary entirely on that. I mean, having somebody go to, but if you're running for the school board and you get elected and you go to the principal and you say, "We think it makes a lot more sense to do this," the principal just can say, "I'm sorry, but the rules don't let me do that." And so that person's going to run into it. So until you take on this systemic brain death of this bureaucratic red tape system, you can elect people who want to do what Gary says, and I agree entirely, but they're going to run into a brick wall the same way that lady at the clerk did. And so that's why I think this is not at least what I'm talking about, is not a reform problem. It's a major philosophy problem, at least as significant as the rights revolution in the 60s or the progressive movement to get rid of laissez-faire 120 years ago. And it's a humanity problem you know, the villain here, there's a villain, but it's not rapacious corporate bosses. The villain is a bureaucratic blob that has disempowered everyone and is kept in place, as Gary suggested, by all these interest groups who feed it. They're all defending the status quo, but they're ultimately not the enemy. The enemy is this blob, and we have to kind of make it into a villain, and we need to replace it with something that's actually responsive to real people in a democratic system of governance.
And if I can, Philip, let me pick up on that just by making 2 points, because I'm eager to hear what members of our audience have to say about these things as well. But 2 quick points. So the first is, how do you do this? And since it requires a change in philosophy, it's something that really can't be just imposed from the top, or will simply replicate all the problems that we have now. But one of the important factoid is that when you look at the issues of police violence, it is not the case that all police departments are equally violent. There is enormous variation across the country, enormous. And so what that tells us is that it's not necessarily endemic to the process of policing. It's the way in which some police departments actually operate. So what we need to do is to figure out what it is that some police departments are doing that others aren't, which will give us a clue to try to find ways of changing the culture and changing the basic philosophy of accountability that you're talking about. So it means that there, not to be too wonky about it, but there's evidence that can drive the way we look at this, which tells us how to go about trying to make that transformation. Second point, excuse me, hay fever day here in Austin. Second point, and this gets to Gary's point as well, there's this basic problem of redistributive politics in particular. That is, these programs that increasingly seek to distribute some goods from some people to others, and even broadly distributed policies like Medicare. One of my single favorite statistics about the federal government that tells us a lot about just how to go about trying to make these transformations is that Medicare and Medicaid, combined with the services for children, account for 25% of the entire federal budget. 25%. So trivia question, what percentage of federal employees are responsible for managing that 25%? And I trot this question out often to people, and most people can't come remotely close. The answer is 0.02%. That is 4,000 people, 1/4 of the total employment of the people running the University of Texas at Austin, which has a staff of 25,000, including faculty and supporting staff. 25,000 people at the University of Texas, supporting about 50,000 students. On the other hand, we've got 4,000 people managing 1/4 of the entire federal budget, being responsible for about $1 trillion worth of spending. What that tells us is that increasingly, much of government is involved in leveraging lots of activity across multiple sectors. There's the famous story about the woman who is always made fun of, holding up a sign at a rally saying, "Keep government's hands off my Medicare." My question is, how could she possibly know that Medicare was in government's hands to begin with? Because in all likelihood, she never encountered a single government official in receiving the health care that she gets. The way in which Medicare works is the terrifically complicated system that goes from the feds to private contractors through a system of private suppliers out there as well. And it's this very complex system that's responsible for doing that. The healthcare.gov kind of problem in terms of getting the website rolled out was a problem of leveraging private contractors in charge of creating the website. And then now that Obamacare is in place, it's different in different places because different states have made different decisions. And the states themselves are not administering the program directly either, because most of the services are being delivered through private healthcare providers and through private contractors. So the underlying piece of this is, in both cases, the 2 important realities. The first is, if we're really interested in making this philosophical change, we need to understand first that there's enormous variation, and we can learn from what works and what doesn't, right, so that we can make what we want to have work well, work more often. The second thing is that we've fundamentally transformed, in both philosophical and operational terms, the way that American government operates, because most government is not done solely within government and government agencies. It slops over between the sectors and between levels of government, so that we've we don't really have a philosophy of governance that embraces the strategies of government that we've created. And so the philosophical change needs to be first grounded in data so we understand who's doing good stuff so we can do more of it. And second, so that we have a system of accountability that understands that a large part of the delivery, for example, of healthcare paid for by government is being done in the private sector. And we need to find ways of having a system of governance that embraces the keep government's hands off my Medicare kind of problem.
Okay, I think we have a question. Abby, I was trying to text you. Let me see if I can add you and if you can ask your question directly. There's Abby.
Hi. So thank you for the discussion. And Gary, thank you very much for referencing my question. I'll just pose it to both Philip and to Don, but mainly Philip. I encountered the problem you're describing when I was researching, as you know, my own book, No Child Left Alone, Getting the Government Out of Parenting. And in that case, what one of the problems that I discovered was the distance between the person having the problem and who could ultimately solve it, right? If you're having a problem with your child's lunch menu at your school, you would actually have to call the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which administers National School Lunch Program,
Right.
gives regulations to the states, which then gives, right? So there's no, so to your point about accountability, one of the problems that I think everybody has been getting at is how far apart the problem is from the potential solution. And that's something that I think is a concerning issue when trying to devise a solution.
Wow, that's a really good question. You know, and a really big problem. I mean, it's just absurd that if you have a nutritional problem with the school, that you would call up a federal employee. I mean, that really sort of illustrates what's wrong. You know, the Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity is pushing responsibility down to the lowest practical level. And law itself is supposed to be a system of outside boundaries where different levels you protect against bad things. So the federal government should get out of, in most cases, the micromanagement business, particularly when it has to do with things like schools. It should be there to catch and to guard against the worst abuses, whether they're discrimination or conceivably nutrition. But it shouldn't be get involved in specific things. The local, you ought to be able to call up somebody at the local school, make your point. If they're doing something wrong, there should be somebody upstairs you can complain to, and that should be kind of, and if that doesn't work, then you can talk to your local councilman who Gary got elected, and they'll do something about it or not. You know, and that should be it. But it goes to the Jen's point about trust and respect. You need somebody. I mean, Jeremy Waldron said, you know, people don't need to have all their problems solved, but they do feel a human need to have their problems honestly addressed. And if somebody says, I'm sorry, I can't help you because all we have in this school are peas and beans, you know, or whatever, at least you got an answer and there's something, you know, associated with it. And you can be frustrated by it, but it's not as if you're being ignored.
Yeah, great. And I don't know if you all know Abby, but she's written this fabulous book, No Child Left Alone. And she's a research fellow over at Carnegie Mellon. So I'd encourage you to take a look at her book as well. Thanks, Abby.
Thank you.
Okay. We have another question coming in. Now I've got to figure out how to, there we go. We have another question from George Doherty. George, I'm going to put you in with us. George is our colleague here at the University of Pittsburgh.
Yeah, so my question So the discussion today and a lot of the really good points that were made kind of mix electoral and legislative processes and so forth in with this concern for actually getting things done, kind of the outcomes focus. So I guess my question is, assuming the electoral and the legislative processes and the incentives that go with those are fixed in the short term, what do you see as some of the most promising management trends or practices that our students or we as scholars can continue to study and to or to promote?
I'm happy to take a stab at that for what it's worth. And a cynic would say that we surely, absolutely, and I'm completely agreeing with Philip about the need for a basic philosophical change. But if we wait for that to happen before we can begin to make progress, then we may have a long dry spell before we can take action, and the situation could get considerably worse in the meantime. I'm in favor of fighting a two-front war on this. One is absolutely and aggressively going at the basic question of bringing more common sense to government and creating a philosophical change. But then we need aggressively to work on things that in fact we can, and here's where I would politely, gently, at least slightly disagree with Jennifer on this, because I think there are things that people can do within government, even the federal government, to be able to make some steps in the short term. So the two-front war would be broad philosophical change to try to rethink our strategies of governance, and then specific, teachable, doable things that in fact students could do. That we need to, for example, to train people about the complexity of programs, that they understand the ways in which you can get leverage over these complex intergovernmental systems. How would you test for COVID? How can we deploy the efforts to try to ensure that we can create a good vaccination system? Turns out that people in emergency management know something about finding ways of responding to natural disasters based on the lessons from Katrina. So there's a whole collection of stuff that's based in theories of complexity that can help us get at that. In terms of dealing with the issue that's come up a couple times about, oh, this is just ridiculous. You come to a line and you can't get your problem solved. There are strategies and techniques about mapping the customer experience and finding ways of changing the ways in which that interaction happens to try to make sure that the customer's needs are filled, and including issues of service design. It has to do with broader issues about risk management that we can teach so that we can understand how systems are vulnerable and they don't really respond as well as they should. It's about getting data out there, but using data that can be visualized to drive changes in public policy. And here's where I think it can circle back around to the broader philosophical questions. The more we can have data that in fact are real, that people can sink their teeth into, that have visuals and stories connected with them, the more we're likely to drive the philosophical debate that we need. It is, I came upon this one website that, as I mentioned earlier, charts the differences in police behavior in different communities. And if it turns out that it's clear as it is that in some police departments, the levels of violence against citizens is very high, and other places it's very low, and that the strategies that the violence in police departments is not connected to the level of violent crime in the community, what does that tell you? It tells you something's going on that's knowable and doable, right. And it tells you where you can go and find out why Minneapolis has this problem and other communities don't. And once you begin to crack that apart, you can say, we can talk about broad strategies of policy change, which we need, but in the meantime, we can make some big difference in the margins, which will have huge effects for people. So, as I said, I'm in favor of a two-front war, a war that first focuses on these broad strategies of governance and changes in philosophy, that helps them, on the other hand, at the grassroots level, make the system better for citizens in terms of mapping the customer experience. And by using data to figure out what it is that works, to use that to drive, and to kind of circle around the other way to talk about how we can use that to drive the governance and philosophical changes. I think one without the other is not going to get us very far, because the big problem with what we're talking about is that we can have this fascinating conversation with each other, but still have a hard time convincing anybody that they ought to pay any attention to it. And so if it's not real, it's going to be hard to get the philosophical change. Without the philosophical change, it's going to be hard to drive the basic grassroots transformations.
Philip.
Yeah, I subscribe to everything Don just said. And I just want to say that the importance of philosophy is not is not first to make the change, is to change the narrative. So you want people asking about police departments, what's the right thing to do here? Why are some police departments more violent than others? What is why does Camden work better? Because culture trumps law, culture trumps everything. You know, there are obviously some bad cultures in police departments around America, and I think probably studies would find. But the narrative shouldn't be a legal narrative. It shouldn't be what's required. That's my problem with this whole system we've created. The narrative everywhere should be, what's the right thing to do? Can we do it? You know, restore the moral basis of public choices at all levels. I mean, let's talk about right and wrong. And so to me, philosophy is important to talk about, not simply to change all these systems, which ultimately will take, you know, well, it's going to take, you know, it's a historic change. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but to change the arguments, to change the public debates, and to begin to do the kind of stuff Don's saying.
And just a quick story about the fact that this is doable, because it's so easy on this to get so discouraged and get so cynical. But the fact is that Thad Allen came into New Orleans after Katrina, and what was one of the arguably biggest debacles of our times, up there at least with COVID-19, and found an absolute mess and turned things around. And he turned things around by changing the narrative in precisely the way that Philip talks about. He came in, and on the first morning he was there, brought in all the people who are working the front lines and said, I want you to know two things. First, I want you to treat everybody that you encounter as if you're a member of your own family. Second, if anybody gives you any grief, I've got your back. And with that, he changed the narrative, changed the story, changed the delivery, and changed the outcomes. And it is that kind of basic philosophical change that in fact produced changes in the results and the behavior. It turns out that it's possible to do this. And I think we need to convince ourselves of the power of action, and convince ourselves, and our students in particular, of the opportunities that they have to be able to make those kind of changes themselves. This is knowable, and it's doable, and we better get to it, or we're going to end up with a country that we're not going to like.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have another question from Ross Elkin. Ross, if you could just introduce yourself. You're on mute.
Sure, I'm here. So I'm buying. Okay, I mean, this is a great discussion. To me, it comes down to what Philip describes as common sense, right? My question is, how likely is it to happen, and do we need to include the elected part of government, the politicians? And I'm wondering if that is, and if it's necessary, is it likely given the current state of elections in this country, which is that politicians are beholden to no one except the donors, right? And the social media followers who are going to get them reelected. You know, as Jonathan Rauch has said, let's bring back the smoke-filled room. Okay, where there can be some vetting of candidates to determine who is actually qualified and capable. So is it necessary to involve those people in making this change? And if so, how likely is it to happen?
Well, let me just say, it's a really good question. I had an argument yesterday with the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, John Micklethwaite, about this. He said, "Oh, Philip, don't get discouraged. It's darkest before the dawn." You know, I was saying, well, it's pretty dark, you know, right now in the political system. Ultimately, this narrative has to appear and be prominent in the political debate. You know, we're not gonna, we could get 300 million of us on the Zoom call, and if the politicians don't talk about it, nothing's gonna change. So we do have to make it what I feel is naive about some people seeking reform is to believe that these changes can happen without some kind of movement. The progressive movement was really a polyglot. It had the temperance people, it had the civil service reformers, it had all kinds of different people, but they did kind of have a big tent and they had a circle. The civil rights movement was clearly a movement. The environmental movement was a movement. The New Deal was different because it had Hoovervilles. It had a crisis with people living on the Washington Mall. But we don't have a movement now. We have fringe movements that I think are only dividing this country on both sides. So, we're holding this forum, and I've been talking to some advisors to both candidates about these issues, but they're not talking about them because it hasn't risen to that level yet. So I don't know. I'd be interested in Don, Gary, Jen's views. I mean, I think we have to make it. You have to make it political. You have to.
Yeah. And absolutely has to be, because in the end, let's face it, this is not a public management problem. It's a political problem. It's a problem that cuts right to the core of our governance, and it cuts right to the basic process. I think it's if you go look back at the evolution of the progressive movement, it really took a while to get a head of steam underneath it. And it took a while to be able to get things going. One of the things that helped to get it going was an assassination that helped to lead to the Civil Service Act that in fact, that leads to a suggestion about, at the grand level, what in part we may need, which is a story. What we don't really have at this point, what the progressive movement had was that story that said, if you don't change it, more things like this will happen. This is bad for the country. What we don't have right now is a more positive story about what it is that's bad for the country and what we can do to try to change it. We just don't have good stories. And one of Phil's great skills is being able to collect these great stories and getting people to latch onto them, because they will remember the story about the person showing up in line, even if they don't remember the R-squareds of some kind of service delivery mechanism. So we need better stories, and we need to get better at storytelling, both about the nature of the problem and about what the solution would look like. So at the grand level, we need, I think, to focus much more on that, because I think that's what's going to drive the change. On the other hand, I think we have to continue to work at the grassroots, at the functional, the operational level, to find ways of making things work better, because in part that'll be what generates the stories, and that'll generate the evidence for success. It'll attract the attention of politicians. That'll be what it is that drives it. And one of the things that is helpful is that some folks may not have heard about this, but there actually are people whose job it is in the federal government right now. The job title is bureaucracy hacker. Their job is to hack through bureaucracies and find a way to make things work without violating the law and staying accountable. They're actually people who do this for a living. And what they're doing is generating evidence about what works, and they're also generating stories. And I think that combination of having people who are out there on the point, hacking through things as if they're going through a forest with a machete, finding a way through the trail, but then using that to blaze a trail for everyone else and creating the stories that can galvanize the movement, that I think is what it is will get things going.
Hey, Gary, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so this is something that was touched on in both Philip's and Don's comments. I think one thing, and probably the most important thing that will help make all of this more accessible, is some great organizing principle, or as Phil's called, a story. Because I mean, the most fundamental type of political activity isn't voting, though that's part of what most of us think. It's having some sort of organized social movement, and that's really how to get the attention of entrenched politicians, because it's so hard to really interpret election results in any sort of unambiguous meaningful way, with some exceptions, because there are many reasons why people vote certain ways. It's really easy to come up with some sort of story that validates your own pre-existing notions of why people should vote the way they are. But if you see people organizing, you see activists talking specifically about particular issues, that's harder to miss. And the threat of later on being voted out based on this underlying story is something that is going to probably be more likely to catch the ears of those, politicians who are willing to listen. It's not really something that we can use to pressure bureaucrats within the machine, because they're not beholden specifically to the people in the same way the politicians are. But having this great organizing principle, and I will say that it's a lot easier to do, or at least the more greater options are there when crises are present, such as during Katrina, such as after the assassination of Garfield. Having that does make things a little bit more doable. So I don't necessarily anticipate we're going to see anything major happen the next year, but I think a lot of the energy that we have now, that may start to pay some dividends a couple of years down the line, at least at the federal level, perhaps some dividends a little bit sooner at local and state levels. But that's something where the jury is still out and will be for a little bit of time. But I think they're both right. Having some sort of great organizing principle is something that is necessary for any of this to really be achieved.
What is the principle? I mean, what is the, I'm curious what everybody's views are. I mean, I'm playing this morning around the idea of the phrase "fix it." I also think the idea of human empowerment is important, or do what's right, or, I mean, there are all these sort of related ideas, but I agree with Gary that we need if we're going to have a movement, we need a principle that people can then put ideas on. What is it? What is it that will appeal to people?
And I think my nomination for that would be a little too wonky and need to wordsmith it a little bit, but it's outcomes. And what really matters, none of it matters unless you get government that actually works and delivers results.
Yeah, results.
Results.
Right. Get it done. Get it done. Yeah.
I mean, I would say either results or accountability, because we need, if we start getting too much into the weeds on specific policy preferences, that's where we can have disagreements and things might fall. But if we start, if the underlying theme is, we want politicians to listen to us, that's something that everyone can agree on in principle, even if we have strong disagreements over how they should listen to us, or if, we think, government should work and provide us with, useful outcomes. Again, I mean, that's a great story that, in the short to medium term might lead to some sort of potential reform. But of course, it's going, once we actually get to, what should the outcomes actually be, that's where we're going to have some sort of disagreement. So the broader organizing principle is going to be useful in the short to medium term to bring people of different political stripes together, if possible. But, once we actually get to, how that is going to play out in terms of specific policy outcomes, that's where I think we're going to start to see our differences rear their heads again. But I mean, I think I would hope most people in the US can agree with the importance of accountability, if nothing else.
And that's why I think talking about results with respect, right? Because within that respect is accountability is really part of that. And it's respect of differences. And, results, I could see, yes, people want results, but results for whom, results for what? And I'm just really surprised, frankly, that we're not seeing more discussion of these issues, given that, we talked about, we see these kinds of movements in the face of a crisis. And one of the things that I'm just really shocked by is the fact that we're not seeing more of a discussion of this, given the fact that maybe it's because we're in the middle of the crisis or the results are so diffuse. Yeah.
Can I just say, I found in my experience that this is an incredibly easy issue to discuss with apple farmers, contractors, people who work in restaurants. And when I go to Yale Law School, it's like I'm talking to a brick wall. I mean, people, they can't, it's like beyond the frame of reference of many, I mean, I don't, we're in an academic
That's
setting,
okay.
but
We're
you know,
good.
many academics that you could actually create a system that gave human agency to somebody they don't know on the ground in some town to fix a problem. What if they, I mean, what if they make the wrong decision? You know, so they wanted this, it's beyond their conception. The idea of human agency, freedom, you know, it's like beyond their conception. And they keep saying, I had this argument with Paul Romer, the economist, Nobel Prize winner, who's really very much on board in this stuff. He said, but you know, he said, giving people discretion is a hard sell, and when Trump is president. I said, I understand that, but we're not talking about giving people discretion, which implies you can do whatever you want. We're talking about giving people responsibility, which means you're accountable for meeting whatever the public goal is. And there's an entirely different idea between an affirmative duty to meet a goal, to be fair to a welfare mother or whatever it is, and discretion to do whatever you want. And the intellectual framing of these issues in the academy has assumed that if you don't tell people exactly how to do things and put legal shackles on every decision, that people will, you know, that it's Attila the Hun that's going to be out there making these decisions.
Yeah. There is a way out of this. I had a long conversation with a presidential candidate in this last cycle, and he was, and it was a he was saying, you know, I've talked with people who are living out there not far away from me, and he, as a liberal Democrat, had been faced with farmers who were talking about restrictions that EPA was putting on the use of their land in terms of pesticides and water use. And they were just at loggerheads because these farmers were so frustrated in exactly the same way that Philip was talking about. But he said that, you know, what they were asking for was just the flexibility to be able to find ways to be able to accomplish the goals of the law without being prescriptive about how to do it. And he sort of was getting his head around that as a possibility. It turns out that liberal Democrats and conservative farmers can find common ground on this if we can allow the opportunity to focus on this kind of focus on outcomes that we're talking about. This is a solvable problem. It's so hard to do it in 140 characters at a time.
And it's a really hard thing to place sort of in how we think about our paradigms of public administration, public management too. Because a lot of the discussion about outcomes and outcome-driven results, as you well know, that was really a product of new public management. There's a whole, you know, movement within the public administration universe right now that's, you know, wants to dismantle new public management. They only focus on the private contracting element of it. And so people don't see this anymore as a movement to give individuals discretion or focus on outcomes. It was just contracting out and privatization. And that was hollowing out the state. And how would you respond to that kind of critique? I mean, we're talking about a movement, I mean, at least the new public management movement had a name to it. Where is it even within our own discipline? I just don't see a coherent, even within you know, the university world, people thinking about these issues don't even have a coherent vision or strategy.
We need to get our collective act together as a field. And Philip, fortunately, is sitting apart from this and doesn't have his fingerprints on it. Is not responsible for it. He's been trying to poke and prod us to try to do this, but we need to own up to the fact that we have not been very good as a field about getting our arms around this fundamental problem. If Philip is right, that this is in many ways the fundamental problem of governance in our era, and if public managers of field is not embracing it, we've got a problem. And the basic problem that we've got, I think, is that in general, I mean, if I could speak bluntly, that in general, public policy schools focus on making decisions and not in carrying them out, that public management is often treated as a bit of a backwater, that public management, in an effort to try to get back into the game, has been embracing either broad philosophical questions borrowed from other problems or other disciplines, using techniques that often don't engage these problems. And we're not talking about this, and we're not engaging it, and we're not devising strategies for trying to get at this. So just for a second, assume that Philip is right, which he may very well be. I mean, he's got me convinced. Then what is it that we would know and do within public management to try to make that happen? And where is our discussion? Where's our literature? Where are our courses? Where's our teaching to try to advance that? And it's one of these things that it's a little hard to lead a movement without a kind of intellectual capital to try to drive it. Because the one thing I'm convinced, we were talking earlier about the importance of an idea. But one of the things that the progressives had is that they had stuff. They had people who were writing about this, thinking about it, talking about it. There was a broad intellectual movement that supported it. Where is the movement to try to support the things we're talking about now? And unfortunately, within the discipline that ought to be leading it, it's sadly just not there.
Right, and I see, go ahead, Phil.
Well, I just want to say, not that you can transpose things from other countries, but there are good ideas in the OECD countries. You know, in New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, Holland, there are lots of good ideas about public management. They've actually given it some thought about changing it and making it work. Again, I'm not suggesting they can be transposed. And there's also, and this discussion is proof of that, there is now a seed that's planted that we're talking about, that other people are talking about too. There's this new book by Micklethwaite and Woolridge called The Wake Up Call that basically says you've got to remake the operating systems of government. There was an article in the Atlantic by George Packer recently about you got to make government work again. Somebody else in the New Republic wrote the same thing. There is a sense that the political bodies and the academy that John said is supposed to be in charge of this, are kind of, they've accelerated past, what's obvious and important, which is how to achieve, how do things actually work? Paul Romer, the economist, has actually written about this. It says, and it's about human needs, and it's also about human capabilities, and it's about the limits of the human brain in dealing with complexity. People cannot deal with these systems. They hate it, and it doesn't work. So don't think of it as a problem. Think of it as an opportunity. It's the Kettl, Murtashvili, Hallibaugh commission on remaking, our public life. It's an opportunity for us.
Right, and I just want to say that I just saw that Paul Dragos Aligika just jumped into our, he's a participant, and he just wrote a brilliant new book that I'd encourage all of you to look at on public entrepreneurship. And it's a really interesting way of thinking about these problems. I won't put him on the spot right now, but we do have a question from Paula Gordon, and I'm going to allow Paula to speak and see if this works. And I'm going to unmute Paula. There we go. Paula, could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, my name is Paula Gordon. I have a doctorate in public administration. I teach online a variety of courses for Auburn University on outreach. Some of the comments I have are the following. I think that the preamble Constitution is the mission statement for the United States, and it's the mission statement that we can base our philosophy of governance and public administration on, and should be doing that. Dwight Waldo had talked about the absence of a purpose of public administration, and I think that is what we are lacking right now. And my dissertation actually deals with a whole subject in it called Public Administration and the Public Interest. It's on my GordonPublicAdministration.com website in its entirety. One of the suggestions I would have is that for the likes of you and those involved in this call, to consider the possibility of making a recommendation to the incoming administration to have a Grace Commission or Ash Commission or reinventing government type effort launched, where people from involving this conversation today would be involved, presumably. I think that could be extremely helpful. I was present at the unveiling of the Reinventing Government effort, and John Kincaid, who was head of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations at the time where I was working as a special project officer, made a comment, and that comment was to David Osborne was, you have not mentioned in the unveiling of this Reinventing Government effort, you have not mentioned anything about the mission of government. And this stopped David Osborne in his tracks, and he said, well, we didn't, but we want to address that next. And I think we've skipped over that. People have forgotten what the purpose of government is. I've tried to address this in my work, and I hope you might be able to. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think, has a great deal of pertinence here. He talked about metamotivation. Metamotivation is what I think the founders had. Metamotivation has to do with being as concerned with the welfare of others as one is for oneself. Maslow had wanted to develop apply this to societal actualization. He never got around to it. He mentioned that in his book, Usakian Management, which has been reprised as Maslow on Management. And I tried to do this in my dissertation, actually, which is a new paradigm of public administration called Public Administration and Public Interest. And I think you'll find one of the things that is discussed there is what is the public interest? And I define public interest as acting in such a way as to maximize the values of life, health, and freedom. And then also in the dissertation, I discuss how this applies to complex societal problem solving.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
Yeah, can I just to make a pitch? In our own little pathetic way, my group, Common Good, has launched something we call a Campaign for Common Good, with a petition that calls for spring cleaning commissions, and in order to clean out legacy bureaucracies and re-empower people to actually achieve public goals. A very distinguished group of people have signed the petition, including Don Kettl, and many others, a bunch of former governors and senators from both parties. And it's our effort to begin the narrative, or to continue the narrative that, that we're having here today, and to try to create some sort of organizational structure behind it. Although I agree with Don, I think one of the most important things that could happen now is have the academy, the public administration experts, start talking about this, they're writing about this. Really important, and change won't happen unless people try to make change.
And one point that I want to add, my wife and I the other day were watching a not very good Goldie Hawn movie called Protocol. And in it, she goes and takes a group of foreign visitors to the National Archives, and they read the Declaration of Independence. And she's surprised that there's a phrase that talks about government and happiness in the same sentence. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And the founders did have something in mind when they were putting this together. There were some big driving ideas, and it's been a long time since we've talked about happiness and government in the same sentence. And there's a reason why they talked about it back in the founding, and why we need to rediscover that now, I think. And the good news is that there's stuff that we can discover and information that I think we can draw on. One of the things that, just in terms of the COVID response, is a dramatic difference between the way that the United States has responded and Germany. Why? They're federal system too. What's the basic difference? And there are basic fundamentals that we can discover then. Yesterday, I was talking to a group of emergency management people from the UK, and they were pointing out the fact that there are some leaders who have done a spectacular job in trying to deal with this. And one was from New Zealand, one from Scotland, one from Germany. And it turns out that they have two things in common. One is a certain style of leadership, and the second is that it turns out that there are gender differences compared to many other foreign leaders as well. So that the difference is there in terms of figuring out new strategies of leadership. For anybody in the academy looking for things to try to research to advance the cause, there are ideas that fall out of the trees by the hundreds every morning for us to be able to pick up. It's earlier Philip was talking about covering the apples, and some of these apples have fallen off the tree and are rolling on the ground and easy for us to pick up and try to find ways of harvesting and try to deal with. So there are ways of trying to create this big idea and to try to reframe the focus on happiness and to try to create strategies for government to be more effective and focus on outcomes. And there are people who are doing it. And so it's a matter, I think, in terms, and our obligation, in fact, to try to build the intellectual capital to try to advance that goal and to try to make that happen. It's something that we have it in our power to do if only we have our wits about us to do it.
Yeah, so with that, I think we've even gone over time. So I just want to thank all of you for this fantastic discussion today.